time. So we are very glad today to host Michael Murphy, who is an SSRH doctoral fellow at University of Ottawa in international relations and political theory. It is quite exciting to see that his research is in a very interdisciplinary emerging paradigm, which often is dubbed as quantum social science or quantum-like modeling, where I'm also working in some ways. And it also tallies quite well with some of the research areas that we are exploring at CASP, as Complexity Economics, Applied Spirituality and Public Policy Research Center at Jindal University. Michael has also contributed considerably to the literature. He has a book with Palgrave 2021 on quantum social theory, and then he has also worked on the editorial board of Security Dialogue, which is also a quite interdisciplinary journal. He's quite busy with writing his thesis and also contributing to journals. So without further ado, I would request Michael to take the stage and present a very fascinating research that he's up to, which is further modifications of his earlier book with Palgrave. So I hope that there is no problem with sharing the screen, but please try once.
All right, so I've got my my screen share on now. Are you able to see that?
Yeah, sure.
All right, perfect. Well, thank you for the introduction, and thank you for having me out to this talk. It's really interesting to engage with the work of the CEASP. I think that it's a great example of what interdisciplinary research can do when you have scholars from different traditions and different academic backgrounds coming together to talk about how we can really ask big questions and think about problems in new ways. The specific presentation that I'm giving today, I'm hoping to situate myself a bit within my research tradition of international relations and international relations theory, but also to show how my research is pushing forward after my book that Sudeep mentioned in the introduction. But I'll give a little bit more context on that later. Just for a brief overview of the presentation, there are four main parts. The first provides a general context, an overview of how quantum international relations has come about, and provides some examples of different research projects ongoing in that area. The second is the more specific context, my research project in quantum social theory and international relations. This is what I'm calling the Quantizing critique project, taken from the book's subtitle. Then I'll shift in the second half towards the specific question of the physics of Track 2 diplomacy, and first provide a brief introduction to this concept of diplomatic practice. And then in the fourth section, outline some parallels and some of the big questions for where to turn next in the question of applying quantum international relations and ideas from quantum social theory to discuss the physics of Track 2 diplomacy. So as I mentioned, my field is international relations. This is kind of the politics between borders, the politics of borders, the politics of the global world. And specifically, I come from the theoretical traditions often called critical international relations theory and critical security studies. So this is perhaps more relational accounts of the world, post-structural accounts of the world, and generally more theoretical approaches that embrace the complexity instead of looking for regularity and law-like predictability. So this first section kind of outlines how quantum international relations arises in the context of this field. So a few of the main sources of quantum international relations, first being the tradition of quantum social theory, such as Dana Zohar's work, drawing on Bohm's interpretation of quantum mechanics, as well as Karen Barad's work, which draws on Bohr's interpretation and the Copenhagen school, but then also developing into her own account of agential realism in quantum mechanics, which incorporates the work of Donna Haraway and queer theory and feminist materialism. The second source is quantum cognition theory, which includes things like the quantum brain hypothesis, psychological modeling, and a more mathematical tradition in that side. This is also related to the quantum-like modeling, which has made great leaps and bounds in econophysics, game theory, financial markets, and those approaches, which I'm sure will be much more familiar to some of the economically minded people on the call today. I would also, in the gambit of quantum approaches to economics, mention David Orrell's work on quantum economics and his approach to value, the question of value in economic markets as a quantum process. Finally, I have philosophy of physics here written as a fourth source. Perhaps this should be the philosophy of physicists, because we do see a lot of philosophical writings from Bohr, Schrödinger, Ravelli, Einstein, and other early interveners into the debates in quantum physics. Their philosophical writings having great interest in international relations circles. So those are kind of the broad influences of quantum IR. But quantum IR itself has produced already some landmark interventions, one being Alexander Wendt's Quantum Mind and Social Science project, where he famously makes the claim that we really are walking wave functions. This is grounded in a theory of quantum consciousness that argues from a very fundamental level that the problem of consciousness shows the insufficiency of Newtonian approaches to social science, and that the idea of a quantum mind can provide that pathway forward. A second, so the logo there on the bottom, kind of in the middle there, that is the logo of Project Q. So this is James Jordarian's research institute housed at the University of Sydney. Project Q has been an ongoing series of conferences and other research projects related to the question of quantum international relations and quantum social theory. A recent output of that project was a special issue of Security Dialogue, which brought together a number of different scholars from the field of international relations to reflect on what it means to raise quantum approaches to international theory and security practice. Third kind of broad tent of quantum IR approaches is what I would call the critical quantum approaches, which include Laura Zanotti's recent book, Ontological Entanglements, Agency and Ethics in International Relations, which is the subject of a forum in the journal Millennium, but would also include the work of Karen Fierke, and this is where I would broadly situate my own work. Some of the dominant questions in quantum IR circles are, what are the Newtonian limitations on existing international relations? And once those are identified, how can we improve by turning to quantum ideas in place of Newtonian? Now, part of that is a description. We have to understand what the problem of Newtonian international relations is before we can move into that quantum realm to kind of justify the so-called quantum leap. But once we're there, we end up with new questions. How can quantum social theory better describe the key phenomena of IR, whether that's state interactions, diplomacy, as I'll be discussing today, or different issues of identity formation, institution making, and so on. There are questions from the game theoretic tradition, and here we might look to the work of Badruddin Arfi. How can quantum game theory model state interactions? And are there improvements that we can make on things like the prisoner's dilemma game to better model state-to-state interactions as compared to more conventional and classical accounts? And finally, more directly linked to the critical quantum group, what ethical implications would follow from a quantum leap when we're not interrogating a world that is of lifeless matter, clearly separable units, following those assumptions of Newtonian substantialism? What ethical implications follow in a world where we are all connected, where we are all entangled? Now to turn a bit more directly, within quantum IR, within the more narrow group of the critical quantum scholars, what is my quantizing critique project? So I believe that there is a prima facie homology between critical international relations and quantum social theory or quantum international relations. And that's because both of these approaches, in most general terms, emphasize relationality, entanglement, and especially the entanglement of the observer to the observed phenomenon and the influence that creates, complexity over law-like regularity, and interference as a matter of interaction. I also believe that recognizing that conventional IR abides in Newtonian imaginary can let us explore quantum international relations as an alternative set of first principles that are especially powerful from the critical position because of this prima facie homology between the kinds of arguments that critical scholars make and the kind of arguments that are made in quantum social theory. So just I'll follow clockwise here. The first piece here is the book of Mcmillan, Quantum Social Theory for Critical International Relations Theorists. This is intended as an introductory text for international relations theorists who might not be as familiar with quantum social theory, but it also develops a methodology for engaging in the practice of quantizing international relations, of converting those Newtonian assumptions or translating them into a quantum imaginary. And I'll have a little bit more to say about the imaginary over the next couple of slides. Moving on to the next piece, we'll see markets are constantly collapsing. Here is one piece where I engage in the practice of quantizing as I see it, and explore how we can reconceptualize the idea of the market as a quantum social wave function. Continuing along, this is my contribution to the Millennium Forum on Laura Zanotti's book, Ontological Entanglements. I look at how we can understand the practice of critique and of post-critique as a kind of entangled ontology and the states of critical international relations theory within that kind of entangled framework of research. The middle piece is a chapter that I contributed to the forthcoming Project Q volume edited by James Derderian and Alex Wendt on kind of the broad state of the art in quantum international relations. And my chapter looked precisely at this relationship between critical international relations and quantum. But I do want to unpack this idea of the imaginary to kind of set the framework for our discussion today. So I draw the idea of the imaginary from the work of Carol Cohn, and specifically from her early intervention into feminist security studies, which made a linguistic argument that the very language used by defense intellectuals limited the kinds of questions that were able to be asked. For example, the consideration of peace is not really part of the vernacular of defense intellectuals in the 1980s, so it makes it very hard to raise questions of peace in a policy relevant way within these circles. Cohn reflects on the power of language and says that once she had mastered this language, she realized that she could not use that language to express her own concerns because it was physically impossible. The language does not allow certain questions to be asked or certain values to be expressed. It's literally unimaginable that certain questions would be asked within a language that does not give you that does not grant the ability to ask those questions. You just don't have the words. I argue in the book that there's a similar thing going on in social science, although perhaps it's not quite as obvious as the lack of one word or the presence of another. I think that the idea of a physical imaginary helps us understand how these ideas from centuries ago at the founding of social theory and social science continue to imply expectations around relata before relations, the importance of law-like regularity and reductive predictability, as well as substantialism, objectivism, and the separation of observer from the observed. And when we're operating within that framework that Newtonian physics provides as a kind of fundamental ontology and physical imaginary for social science, there are certain things in life that are just unimaginable. For example, the idea of entanglements and the ability of cause to travel faster than the speed of light. It just becomes hard to wrap your mind around the immediate changes that are possible within social bonds. There's no way to imagine that without either breaking the laws of your physical imaginary or kind of roughly approximating it in a way that doesn't do justice to the immediacy of social change in a global world. I argue that by adopting a quantum physical imaginary for critical international relations, we can literally imagine the unimaginable, or at least what was previously unimaginable in a Newtonian context. One path that I offer for this transition is quantizing through translation. This is one of the two key methodological propositions that I offer in the book. The first step in quantizing through translations is to identify the concepts in social theory or social science that are homologous to concepts in quantum social theory, and secondly, then reading the insights of the conventional theory through a quantum imaginary. This is informed by theories of translation developed by sociologists of science, Michel Coulon and Bruno Latour, as well as the German philosopher Walter Benjamin, and theories of diffraction developed by Karen Barad in the context of quantum social theory, but more broadly in Donna Haraway's work in queer theory and posthumanism. I think that the reason that we would want to translate into a quantum imaginary is precisely because it offers this new powerful vocabulary to understand complexity, paradox, uncertainty, but also relationality and entanglement in a way that we just are unable to do within a Newtonian framework. The key kind of quantum social theoretic idea for the study of track 2 diplomacy is social entanglement. Now, of course, the name kind of gives it away. This is related to the idea of entanglement in quantum physics, the connection that permits that kind of spooky action at a distance, as Einstein called it. Social entanglement pops up in a number of different contexts in quantum social theory and quantum social science, and I'll just run through three quickly here. Within quantum game theory, we see predictions that entanglement will lead to increased cooperation in the context of state-state relations in the work of Badgerd and Arfi, and Hanauske et al. In 2010 made a similar argument in the context of financial markets. Dana Zohar's quantum social theory explains entanglement as a kind of bond building within a social context that can then lead to social cohesion and group identities, community building, those sorts of positive political projects of very direct policy relevance, especially today, in a world where we aren't able to see people like we used to. Quantum international relations has seen arguments that entanglement can explain strategic relationality in Fierke and Alfonso Antonio's work, ethically responsible development in the work of Laura Zanotti, and Alexander Wendt has argued that language provides a kind of entanglement that allows meaning to be made. So this assemblage of ideas related to social entanglement forms the bedrock of my investigation into Track 2 diplomacy. So what I will do for this section introducing Track 2 diplomacy is first to provide a brief definition, second to provide a timeline of these efforts in Track 2 diplomacy, outline some differences between Track 2 and conventional diplomacy, and then finally speak to the difficulty of defining the idea. So I'm quoting here from a book by Peter Jones. Peter Jones is a professor at the University of Ottawa as well, and he's been involved in a number of Track 2 diplomacy efforts, as well as the academic study of diplomacy and also formal diplomacy processes for the last decades. And Jones here says that he's come to define the term Track 2 as unofficial dialogues, generally between two antagonistic parties, and often facilitated by an impartial third party, and involving individuals with some close connections to their respective official communities, focused on cooperative efforts to explore new ways to resolve differences over or discuss new approaches to policy-relevant issues. So a Track 2 diplomacy is a conflict resolution process, but it's not a traditional diplomatic effort where you might send the head of state or Minister of Foreign Affairs to discuss possible solutions and attempt to lead a meeting with a firm commitment, to address the particular conflict resolution process. Instead, in Track 2, we're looking at unofficial dialogues where influential elite members of a society will get together, but this is following the Chatham House rules. It is an informal communication that seeks to build understanding or explore new possibilities, but not to reach a kind of firm official conclusion to the conflict resolution process. The idea is that this will be more fruitful in the long run because it allows for more open lines of communication. It allows for the building of understanding and potentially for the kind of transformative societal approaches to peace that people like Galton talk about. The idea of Track 2 or these kinds of less official paths to peace are not entirely new. You see them, Jones outlines a rough timeline that includes early efforts of post-World War I peace societies meeting in The Hague through the Cold War era at the Pugwash and Dartmouth conferences. And then he highlights a number of key individuals in the theorization of things like Track 2, such as John Burton's Controlled Communication, which saw these kinds of unofficial facilitated workshops, often related to international boundary disputes. Herbert Kelman, or a little bit later, but around the same time, talking about interactive problem solving, again using facilitated discussions where someone is not there to arbitrate or mediate conflicting parties, but to facilitate a broader discussion that allows the conditions for peace to be developed. And this eventually crystallizes in Joseph Montville's term Track 2 diplomacy, which he believed would be more policy relevant for the folks in the official diplomatic channels. There's a great diversity. This is just one snapshot of non-official conflict resolution strategies related to Track 2 diplomacy that share these kinds of rough similarities of unofficial dialogue, facilitation, often looking more to create the conditions for peace that might then lead to a more lasting peace rather than a single action, kind of sink or swim, fail or pass that would come from a meeting of leaders. There are different goals between what we might call track 1 and track 2 diplomacy. Obviously, track 1, if we think of a great, a very formal meeting of two heads of states where the countries are in conflict, this is very visible. These are diplomats acting in official capacity, signing agreements or not signing agreements, resolving conflicts or not resolving conflicts. This is just simply not the case with track 2. It's often invisible. The participants in these processes are non-official. It's not the head of state acting in an official capacity. It could be an influential member of society. It could be someone with links to the government or the governing party, but not someone there with any kind of signing authority on behalf of the government. This is focused on the process more than the outcome, setting the stage for a lasting peace, lasting conflict resolution, rather than some kind of short-term solution. But the diversity in these kinds of approaches makes it very difficult to define. Jones argues that with so many often conflicting dimensions in play, it is probably impossible to come up with a concrete explanation or definition of track 2, which will cover all cases. Of course, as social scientists, we don't like to see this, because if we can't define it properly, then how will we measure it? How will we assess the success? And how will we strategize if we're looking to influence public policy and provide good counsel to the foreign affairs of our country? How can we do that if we don't know what it is? So the question that I would like to pose is, what if the difficulty of defining track 2 tells us less about the nature of track 2 and more about the limits of the Newtonian physical imaginary that is dominant within conventional social science? And what if track 1 diplomacy is easy because it is that kind of yes, no outcome between clearly defined parties with clear lines of authority, rather than this kind of complex, uncertain reality that we find within the case of track 2. And that brings me to the preliminary reflections here on the relationship between quantum international relations and the physics of track 2 diplomacy. I think that there are at least 3 quantum-like features of track 2 that could ground an effort to translate track 2 diplomacy from a Newtonian imaginary to a quantum imaginary. First being the general shift from competition to cooperation. Because track 2 seeks cooperation without costly signaling, mediated choices, strategic reassurance, and all of those conventional ideas that we have around game theory and alliance formation, the priorities are kind of shifted in a different direction. I think quantum-like strategic entanglement describes this cooperation through informal connectivity in much the same way, right? We're not looking at the specific outcome of one roll of the dice or one play in the game, in the quantum game, but through the non-play connectivity between the quantum actors. Similarly, I think the shift from decision moments to possible futures or conditions of potentiality can provide a second place to ground a quantum-like understanding of track 2 diplomacy. And here, track 2 is not focused on definitive outcomes, but instead creating a framework for future understanding, shaping the conditions of peace instead of imposing one narrow moment of peace. And quantum-like constructive interference describes 2 social wave functions interacting to expand the spectrum of potentialities, which can be understood as a way of expanding the possible options or expanding the range of possible options for future decisions, rather than focusing on the success or failure, yes or no outcome in one specific case. Finally, we can understand track 2 as a shift from emphasis on formal decision makers and their outcomes to understanding builders. Track 2 trades official diplomats for unofficial yet socially connected individuals, and they work to build understanding against what might be the destructive interference of prejudice, where certain countries will assume things about another nation, and those assumptions and ill-gotten beliefs about the other nation will prejudice them against the possibility of honest and productive conflict resolution. By building understanding, rather than trying to rush a decision before the conditions are such that the peace can be lasting, we will pursue that quantum peace. So I think that if we think back to the 3 examples of social entanglement that I discussed earlier in the talk, we can find direct connections to track 2 diplomacy. On the prediction that entanglement produces higher rates of cooperation, we see that track 2 seeks greater connections before those decisions have to be made, before the plays of the game, so to speak. On social entanglement as bond building, we see that track 2 seeks to build bonds between elite non-representatives in social settings to promote future conflict resolution by preparing the conditions for a lasting peace. And finally, on the suggestion that entanglement explains strategic relationality and ethically responsive development, track 2 efforts to build relations that can resolve differences and explore new approaches speak both to the positive efforts of constructive interference in expanding the potentiality of future peace and mitigating destructive interference around prejudicial assumptions made about one nation or another. I think this raises a number of important questions around track 2 as a quantum strategy. Across a number of different fields of study. These are not all my areas of expertise, so I pose these more as suggestions for future research rather than conclusions that I have reached on my own. First, for those in policy circles and in strategic studies, I wonder, can quantum diplomatic strategies inform peace building and conflict resolution as a way of focusing more on the conditions and the potentialities of peace, rather than forcing processes to reach a breaking point which may succeed or fail before that kind of groundwork is laid? For quantum game theory, I ask, can quantum game theory address the lack of game theoretic modeling of track 2 diplomacy? Similarly, I wonder if expanding into other cognitive modeling and other kind of predictive modeling, can that address similar gaps in the modeling of track 2 diplomacy? I know that there's a lot of expertise in the research center around this, so I'd be fascinated to hear what you all might think. For social theorists, how does quantum social theory influence constructivist concerns of norms, identities, institutions, and so on that are so important in the social aspect of diplomacy, of track 2 diplomacy, and of the whole project of building understanding of peace on the world stage? And finally, for my fellow international relations theorists, with the understanding that quantum ideas offer to the difficult to define case of track 2 diplomacy, I ask, what other case studies stand to benefit from a quantum leap? What other problems can we solve? Or maybe, if we can't quite solve them, what problems can we understand better? Thank you so much. That is the end of my talk. I really look forward to the questions. And I'll just stop sharing my screen.
Yeah. Okay, thank you so much. Thank you so much. It is really a stimulating talk, Michael, and I'm sure that Naresh, Shivangi, who has just joined us, Cheshta, our other fellows would be quite keen to interact with you over time also, not simply this seminar because of limited time. So I would definitely like to go to each of them, but just a couple of points, if I may. Actually, Naresh and I are basically working on quantum game theoretic framework and how to use that for poverty reduction policies, and SDG goals and so on. And I found while I was going through your track to diplomacy thinking, I found that there is a very interesting connection between what we are trying to do from mathematical point of view and what you are trying to suggest from a more conceptual philosophical framework. So that would be a great thing that if we can collaborate over time in that area. The second point before I move to others is that in quantum game theory, entanglement does play a very important role, as you have rightly mentioned. But as of now, in quantum game theory, the norm is that the players are going to share some physical resource where entanglement can be embedded. So it is like physical entanglement rather than any other thing. And then the mathematics shows that, well, if that is possible, then certainly there are improvements in equilibrium results, and like we can go to cooperations, as you have rightly mentioned. So it would be very fascinating to think that given this mathematical framework of entanglement, how that corroborates with your track to diplomacy framework of entanglement. That would be, I think it is a very, very promising area to explore. So these are like 2 points, and then certainly there are many deep philosophical points of contextuality, complementarity, and we can go on for a long time in that. But definitely let me turn to my colleagues. So anyone who would like to go first, Naresh or Shivangi, thank you very much.
Unless, of course, Michael wants to react to what you have just said. Maybe, I don't know, Michael, you want to react to that, and then we can ask some other questions?
Yes, I'll just I'll try to keep my responses short. I know that's often a problem with academics who get excited about the new ideas that come up in the Q&A section, and then they just all keep going on. I do think that the idea of pairing track to diplomacy and this kind of, as you said, conceptual approach to the ideas of game theory would be a really interesting match for work on sustainable development and poverty reduction. Yes, please let's keep in touch on that item. Around the idea of physical resource sharing, I think because track to diplomacy often revolves around things like border disputes, resource access, things like that. There are some natural, perhaps there are some easy cases to begin with, and then as we progress through the easy cases, we can take on more conceptual or more tangential cases later on to as we pick up steam. But I do take the point that kind of that physical aspect does become important when we are applying the mathematics. Again, this is not my direct area of expertise, so I do greatly appreciate the insights of the experts. So.
Thank you very much.
Yeah, so thanks, Michael. Just to bridge that that response and the comment made by Sudeep, it is really perhaps the very first talk that I've listened to on quantum relationships, in which I didn't hear words like Hamiltonian and Hilbert space, and and I didn't see an equation. I don't think I've ever heard any talk before, so it looks like we can have some amount of useful research and work even without necessarily the modeling, not at all to minimize the importance of that modeling work, but the complementarity, I think, would be really important. And, you know, we are in a school of public policy. And so we constantly, our interest has to be what does it mean for public policy, and what public policy questions can we better answer because of the insights we get from this kind of thinking. And I think you are really onto something. But of course, you know, at the beginning of your talk, we had this little chit chat on how is the paradigm taking root or not, and the challenges we face there, not only in the practical world of public policy, but in the academic world of researchers and publishers, you know, editors of journals who find it difficult to come to these relationships. The references you made in your introduction are references I look at all the time and have read all of these people, starting with Bohm, who is my guru on quantum physics. And then, you know, the social scientists working with quantum theory relations, Dana Zohar, Karen Barad, Alexander Wendt, Laura Zanotti. I've read all of these, their books. And somehow we need to be able to use this thinking that they have all put on the table and answer some real world questions, which you are beginning to do. So I see, you know, the work you're doing as really applicable in the arena of international public policy. I mean, in a way, diplomacy is all about international public policy. We try to solve those international public policies through interstate relationships, and indeed in more informal tracks as well, where not only state officials are engaged, but others as well. And so the question then, you know, that I come to is, well, before I go, I would really like to read Carol Cohen's paper. If you have it handy when we are done, maybe you can share it. I'm sure you probably have it in your library. That would be of great interest. The quantum imaginary in the space of international public policy in today's world. And, you know, we have really complex negotiations of all kinds. Climate change is perhaps the most complex one I have personally engaged with. But these are multilateral types, and they are really multi-actor, multi-relationships, a whole range of issues that benefit from track 2, but largely driven by track 1 still. SDGs, as was mentioned. So you know, I just wanted to get a sense from you, where are we now? Are people uptaking? Are the United Nations, you know, if you want to call it the real world? I am, now that I'm in academia, I don't always say the real world, because I always felt that academics were in some strange place and they have no idea what we do in the real world. You know, and by that I meant working for the federal government of Canada or working for the United Nations, where diplomats spend end hour back in the day with cigarettes and coffee. Well, where are we now in bridging the academic research with the real world as I have used to define it? That's what I'd like to hear from you more broadly. It is clear to me that the work you're doing is directly related to our interests, absolutely. And we would be building this relationship as Sudeep has started. So that's why I'll put that on the table. But before you answer, maybe we should get our colleague Shivangi to comment as well, if you don't mind, and then you can, you know, take them together. So why don't we turn to Shivangi?
Yes, thank you, Professor Naresh, and thank you, Sudeep, for organizing this. Hi, Michael. Just to briefly introduce myself, I am Shivangi Chandel. I do game theory for a living. not the quantum game theory which you're so familiar with, but the if a just counterpart like the classical game theory. So now, if I was completely broaching the subject from the idea of whatever I know of classical game theory, which is that when you try to even think about modeling it a little bit, in terms of especially the track two diplomacy, I can already, I expect a result which will include multiple equilibria. And, um, as somebody who has been trained to not find those problems interesting, because, the problems which have multiple equilibria as solutions are not perhaps perhaps not you shouldn't go more into it. So in that respect, I'm really glad that there is this new field which is coming up, which is trying to trying to get into the, like Professor Naresh keeps telling us, trying to get into the complexity of multiple equilibria. So already, when I was thinking of modeling this situation, okay, even if we use networks, or even if we use, say, multi-round bargaining, or so what possibly could I, envision, or what possibly would be the end game? And the answer is that, yeah, we'll be stuck with multiple equilibria. And then that will be the question would be, then what? What are you proposing as a policymaker? And which is why, very often people say, okay, don't just look at problems where you could find a unique solution. So in that respect, yes, you're right to say that maybe some kind of, some way of interpreting these track two diplomacy through quantum entanglement is the way forward. So that's all. That's all I wanted to say over here. Over to you, Michael. Professor, you have to unmute yourself.
Sorry, I was just saying, Sudeep, you seem to have your hand up. Please go ahead and you take over the chairing.
Okay. Yeah, just a few points. Actually, first of all, going back to the project that we were discussing with Michael on our game theoretic approach, I think that with the help of his framework of track two diplomacy, we'll really be able to make that bridge between the hardcore mathematical modeling and the really very much required communication between policymakers and other, and not only that, more like a general audience. I think the track to diplomacy framework would be quite helpful in that. Otherwise, it always remain as a kind of esoteric mathematical modeling. Say also, going back to my own experience, I will just mention one thing that as you know that I'm writing this book with Professor Partha Ghosh on quantum games. So when we approached CUP with our book, they were very interested in the proposal, but then they said that whom you are aiming this book to, who is their target audience? And we told that, well, we would like to go for social sciences and interdisciplinary audience. They just came back to us and no, you can't do this because this is physics and you need hardcore mathematics students to follow all this. Otherwise, we will be facing problem in marketing the book. But then certainly we started discussing with them. No, there are other fields also. Now they have somewhat agreed, but then still this kind of mental block remains that no, it is hardcore mathematics. Why you are bringing all these things? So that we have to really bridge. And I think that the framework which Michael is suggesting will be the right direction towards that. Based on mathematics, I'm certainly not demeaning that. Certainly that is there. That is the first observation. And the second thing that, as Shivangi mentioned very beautifully, the multiple equilibria problem, which is always the central of problem of game theory in general. Quantum games have been evolved basically also to tackle the multiple equilibria problem. There are some beautiful papers by Azhar Iqbal, who's like one of the gurus in quantum games, who have shown that if that framework is used, then you can drastically reduce at least the kind of emergence of multiple equilibria, rather cut down your choice more and more to improved equilibrium. So that's just a technical point. So over to you, Michael.
Should we check and see whether our trip fellow Chester had anything to add? Chester, did you have anything to add, or are you okay?
Hi, Professor Singh. Hi, Professor Batra. Hi, Professor Shivagi, and hi, Michael. No, I really don't want to add anything, but I just want to agree with Professor Singh right now. We really know what complexity theory, what quantum social science are offering to us, but how do we really take it to the real world? Because we as researchers are understanding it. I'm talking about my part here. I'm really understanding what complexity theory right now means to me, but how do we really take it to the policymakers who are sitting in the offices, and we really want how we convince them to apply that there, as Professor Singh rightly mentioned, how do we apply it to the real world? I just want to add this. Otherwise, thank you so much for the talk. Yeah.
Over to you, Michael.
All right. Well, I definitely have a lot to think about, and I'll try to address the big points, but I won't. Obviously, the time is limited here. So just following in the order that I have them sketched out here. The first question around the ability of these kind of quantum ideas to inform public policy. You know, this was a bit of a theme in the questions, really, and I think that, you know, approaching it conceptually has a certain accessibility to policymakers who might not have the specific training in mathematics. And one way of starting that conversation is to highlight the significant influence that Newtonian ideas have had on public policy, and especially on diplomacy outside of the math again, right? Newtonian ideas fundamentally reshaped the notion of balance of power in the 100 years after Newton's writing, compared to earlier mentions of balance of power. And Bentley Allen's recent book on cosmology and scientific orders in international relations does an outstanding job of highlighting the changes between pre-Newtonian and then Newtonian physics. He's mainly looking at European diplomatic circles. So there has already been a history of concepts coming from physics to influence diplomatic practice. And although Newtonian ideas might be too rough an approximation for the kinds of global problems and complex problems that policymakers face today, we can still learn from the rhetorical strategies of introducing Newtonian ideas. Similarly, evolutionary ideas and the rise of Darwin's influence in social theory. Of course, there are a number of very serious negative consequences from both the ideas of Newton and the ideas of Darwin, but these are concepts that are taken from science and imported into social theory, social science, and the practice of public policy. On the second question on the problem of publishing, I think that one of the ways to do that is to approach these questions of applied policy by highlighting the Newtonian influence on dominant ideas, kind of like it just finished mentioning with regards to balance of power or the systems theory influence of hegemonic stability. These are largely derived from conceptual rather than mathematical approaches to Newtonian physics. And the whole so-called scientific revolution in international relations theory, in the mid-1900s, saw a lot of other ideas come, sometimes bringing the math with them, although not in their full complexity. Other times, just remaining at a more conceptual or a theoretical level. To the question of where are we now? Are people taking up the ideas? I think we are at early stages. I think that there are a number of notions circulating that we don't have the conceptual tools to build peace in complex problems, to address poverty reduction in complex situations, and perhaps quantum can, by offering a better diagnosis of the problem, open up space where proposing a solution or informing policies that lead to a solution are possible. One of the issues in international relations, at least, is that these conceptual frameworks are not, they're not widely enough understood that the academic article can say in the introduction, I'm using a quantum approach, and then go directly into the fieldwork. Right? There's still a good third of the paper to a half of the paper that explains this is Newton, this is quantum, here's how it fits together, and then goes through the development of the ideas for the audience. So until there's enough of that critical mass of scholarship that permits the ideas to run full speed ahead, we can't have that application section of the paper because there just aren't enough words in the journal. To take a rather crude example, I'm working with a colleague right now on taking these quantum ideas and applying them to his research on community-based natural resource management in climate change and how climate change affects that in Namibia. And our difficulty is explaining first the theoretical framework of the quantum ideas and making sure there's enough introduction to that, and then introducing climate change, and then the policy context, and then his field work, and then by the time we get to applying the ideas, we're just running out of ink. But my hope is that as the conceptual frameworks are more often explained, then we do have perhaps a bit more freedom to get into the policy analysis, the policy prescriptions, and those real-world case studies. To Shivangi's question and great insights on the multiple equilibrium problem and game theory, this is a bit the mathematics of that are a bit out of my league, and I'm more than happy to collaborate rather than to just push that off to the side. But I won't be able to give a fulsome response to that question. Perhaps what I can say at this point is that the reason that it's so important, I think, to approach things like track 2 or things that defy definition from a quantum perspective is because perhaps it is that problem of definition that prevents the measurement, assessment, and understanding. So it's not about applying a quantum model at the end to something that might in the future, that might somewhere previously be quantum, or just applying it as a kind of neutral lens to assess outcomes. But my idea here is that we can't understand thing X because we've been looking at thing X through a Newtonian lens. What if we approach thing X from a quantum lens? Then we can define the problem and understand it from the beginning. Sorry, Sudeep, I see your hand.
Yes. I'd just like to mention one particular framework, might be relevant to the discussions that we are doing. This particular framework has been put forward by Carlo Rovelli, as you know, is a very, very brilliant quantum gravity expert, whatever that means. and I had very fortunately, I had an email exchange with him also. Now, this particular framework is relational framework. So relational framework, and he has actually been motivated by Nagarjuna from Buddhist philosophy. So Shunyavada and so on. So according to this particular framework, he is trying to mainly look at quantum physics, but we can extend this. This basically shows that the ontology itself is relation between systems. So it is not like isolated systems. Relationship itself is in the ontology of the world. And then everything, all the properties that we are talking about, that is all are relational properties. So there is nothing called as intrinsic property. So then he builds upon that hugely and so on. Maybe you can look up to that particular framework because I'm using that framework in one of my research. So I find that that relational view is somewhat very useful in case of international relations and political relations, and also from the point of view of quantum philosophy, because he's coming from that background basically. So all, you know, all the interference effects and all the entanglement and decoherence or whatever, they can all be explained from the point of view of relational framework. So I just thought that that view might be useful for us, relevant to us. Kaldur, over.
Absolutely. Absolutely. Yeah. I think that, it's interesting that we have these different approaches that are bringing variations on the same insight. Not to diminish the individual accomplishments of Ravelli and Barad and Zanotti, but each of them bring a different kind of relationalism to bear upon the quantum, the question of the quantum world. And I think, these kinds of the kind of work like happens at the CEASP and at the Quantum Bootcamp and at Project Q, where we bring people together from the different traditions. It's just so important if we're going to break down the disciplinary silos and build new ways of understanding, which I think is really the way that quantum ideas take the leap from quantum social theory, quantum game theory, quantum whatever theory into the world. And that's, I think I am out of time, so that is perhaps the massive provocation that I will end.
I think that we had a very good conversation, and it is very good that only few people joined, because otherwise we couldn't have done this so intensely. And that's a blessing in disguise. So, and I think that we will continue, and Naresh, I, Shivangi, all of us, and we will continue on the interaction, and definitely specifically our poverty reduction project, that maybe we can chat over Zoom sometime later, very soon, maybe next week or so on, to think about it. And so let's see, and let's open up this. So thank you very much. And if Naresh would like to have the final words.
Well, just to say thanks as well, Michael. If it were not for COVID-19, I'm sure we would have had a coffee in a cafe somewhere in the Byward Market.
Definitely.
I have also been teaching this year at Ottawa U. I taught a course on monitoring and evaluation in the International Development School, the School of Globalization and International Development Studies. So we have more than one connections, but we can't meet for this coffee, I guess. Although slowly things seem to be coming back to normal. We only had about 5 or 6 cases per day over the last few weeks. So looks like Ottawa is doing well enough for us to get together at some point. So thanks very much. My concluding comment, it seems to me after 3 decades of thinking about these problems, is to shift from individual agents and individual objects to relations. That's the main shift, and I think that's what we are all saying. Thanks again, Michael, and we'll see you soon. And thanks to all of our colleagues as well.
Thank you very much, Michael. So we keep in touch, and maybe very soon we meet on Zoom again. So, okay, so I'm just closing the recording now, and then we'll upload this on our website.